You've probably seen a Venetian mask before, maybe in a film or on a postcard, or hanging in the window of a tourist shop where the smell of cheap glue battles with the perfume of leather. You picture feathers, gold paint, curling filigree, something glittering and festive, a bit of carnival magic, a fantasy where everyone is mysterious, glamorous, and always half-lit by candlelight. That's the Hollywood version of Venice. It's champagne, gondolas, and strangers who speak in riddles. But the Moretta, that one doesn't show up in the glossy brochures, because the Moretta mask was not glitter, it was not sequins, it was not even remotely comfortable. It was in fact a black oval of velvet that turned your face into a void. No eyeshadow, no witty smile, no sly wink, just an eerie blankness. The kind of thing you'd expect more at a secret ritual in a damp cellar than on a sunny canal. And here's the part that truly makes it unforgettable. To wear it, you had to hold a button inside your mouth. Not straps, not ties, just a button clamped between your teeth. Imagine trying to sip wine like that. Imagine trying to laugh. You couldn't. Now you may be tempted to laugh at the design flaw, but to a Venetian woman of the 17th or 18th century, this was not a joke. This was fashion. And fashion, especially in Venice, was never about comfort. The Moretta wasn't meant to make your life easier. It was meant to make you look mysterious, obedient, and let's be honest, just a little bit unsettling. Think about it. Other Venetian masks let you talk. The famous Bauta, that white mask with the jutting chin, was designed so you could eat and drink while still covered. It was practical, if you can call social deception practical. But the Moretta, it silenced you. Quite literally, you couldn't speak. Your mouth was busy holding onto that button. You were reduced to gestures, to the tilt of your head, to the silence that stretched longer than anyone wanted. And in a society obsessed with performance, secrecy, and disguise, that silence had power. Let's pause here and picture daily life in Venice at that time. The city was noisy, even then. Water slapping at stone walls, gondoliers shouting, their voices bouncing through narrow alleys like seagulls trapped in a bottle. The constant stink of the lagoon, sometimes fishy, sometimes rotten, sometimes almost sweet in its decay, and people everywhere, merchants calling out, church bells tolling, the scrape of wooden wheels over bridges. Now into this chaotic cityscape, picture a figure gliding by in complete silence, a woman dressed in heavy silks, her face erased into a black oval. She can't speak, and you can't tell if she's looking at you or someone behind you. That was the Moretta. Of course, you might imagine silence as peaceful, but in Venice it was unnerving. People filled the gaps in conversation with gossip. Silence meant you were hiding something. It meant your thoughts were sealed behind that velvet void. A modern comparison? Think of someone wearing mirrored sunglasses indoors at night, refusing to answer your texts. That's the energy. The Moretta was known as the servetta muta, the mute servant. The nickname wasn't just playful, it cut right to the mask's essence. Women wearing it became silent, pliant, enigmatic. They became visual objects in a social game where men still held the louder cards. You can imagine the mixed feelings, liberation through anonymity, but also restraint through enforced silence. A double bind sewn together with black velvet. And it's worth noting, black velvet wasn't just chosen at random. Venice adored the theatrical. The fabric absorbed light, flattening features, turning a woman's face into an unreadable void. In dim candlelit salons, the mask must have looked like a floating absence, a hole in the room. A strange paradox. The mask made you visible precisely because it erased you. If you've ever worn something trendy but wildly impractical, say shoes that pinch your toes until you reconsider every life decision, you understand the logic. The discomfort wasn't a flaw, it was part of the point. You suffered to show you belonged. You bit down on that button, not because it was fun, but because fashion in Venice was always a performance of extremes. And Venice, by the 1600s, was running on performances. The Republic was past its golden mercantile peak, but it still had its carnival, its elaborate rituals, its strange obsession with disguises. Masks weren't just party favors, they were woven into the rhythm of life. By law, Venetians could wear masks not just during Carnival, but on many other occasions, gambling halls, certain public events, secret meetings. It was a culture that blurred boundaries between reality and theatre, so naturally the Moretta fit in. But if you step back for a moment, you might wonder, Why would anyone choose this mask over others? Why go mute when you could strut around in a mask that allowed you to eat, drink, and whisper dirty jokes? The answer lies in the subtle power of silence. A woman in a Moretta mask didn't need to speak. She was seen, but not heard. Desired, but not challenged. The mask exaggerated the social script already written for women. It enforced it physically, with that button clenched between teeth like a gag disguised as fashion. You may also picture the small gestures it demanded: a hand wave, a tilt of the chin, a half turn toward or away from someone. Communication pared down to the smallest flickers. If you've ever texted only with emojis for an entire day, you get a taste of how limiting and strangely freeing it must have been. A woman became a kind of living doll, enigmatic precisely because her range was so reduced. The silence had another effect. It made the wearer's company unpredictable. Men could project whatever they wanted onto the masked woman: charm, shyness, mystery, submission. She didn't correct them because she couldn't. The mask allowed fantasy to flow unchecked. You might say the Moretta was less about hiding the face and more about creating a blank page for others to write on. And here's the twist. The mask wasn't for just anyone. It was mainly worn by noble women, women who already had a certain degree of visibility and power in Venice's narrow social circles. Wearing the Moretta was both a privilege and a restraint. You had to have the resources to indulge in this kind of theatrical discomfort. A poor woman couldn't afford to glide around silent and veiled in velvet. She had work to do and mouths to feed. In that sense, the Moretta was as much a symbol of status as a silk gown or a pearl necklace. If you could afford to spend hours being mysterious and silent, it meant your life wasn't bound to bargaining at the fish market or scrubbing linens by the canal. Like most fashion, it advertised not just beauty, but privilege. Now, imagine the setting. A Venetian salon, candles dripping wax onto brass holders, the air heavy with the scent of beeswax, sweat, and expensive perfume, trying to mask both. Nobles clustered around gambling tables, men talking too loudly, women listening too quietly, and in the corner, a woman in a Moretta mask. She doesn't laugh, she doesn't sip her drink, she doesn't say a word. Her silence presses into the room like an unspoken dare. That was the power of the mask. But the joke, if you can call it one, was that the wearer wasn't free either. She couldn't remove the mask without losing her aura. She couldn't speak without spitting out the button. The mask gave and took away at the same time, a tool of allure, but also of control. And that tension between liberation and restraint was what made it both fascinating and eventually suspicious. Because societies don't like things that can't be explained, and the Moretta, with its strange silence, provoked questions. Was the woman mysterious, or was she being silenced? Was she alluring, or was she trapped? Was the mask empowering, or humiliating? The answer, uncomfortable as always, was both. And so the Moretta floated through Venetian life for over a century, part fashion, part ritual, part social riddle. You could see it at Carnival, but also at solemn occasions, even funerals, a mask for all moods, so long as you kept your mouth shut. Literally. Every time I sit down to share one of these stories, I wonder where you might be listening from. Maybe it's late at night. Maybe the sun's just beginning to rise. Wherever you are, let the room get quiet. Find a spot that feels easy to rest in, and we'll wander gently into tonight's story together. If you close your eyes and picture Venice, you might imagine gondolas drifting, carnival masks glittering, and maybe a violin playing somewhere faintly out of tune. It feels like a postcard city, the kind you can't believe was ever real. But beneath that romantic glaze, Venice was a very strange place indeed. Not just strange because it's built on mud and wooden stilts that miraculously haven't collapsed. Strange because it was a city where people wore masks far more often than you'd think socially acceptable. Masks, in Venice, weren't just for costume parties. They were daily tools. Imagine living in a city where it was normal, legal, even expected to cover your face for months at a time, not only during carnival season, but in gambling halls, at political debates, and during certain religious festivals. It's as if you could walk into your local supermarket with a ski mask on, and everyone would nod approvingly. That was Venice. The city had a peculiar logic. Its government, the most serene republic, liked order. It liked hierarchy, stability, predictability. But the people squeezed into narrow canals and crowded stone alleys liked pleasure, gossip, and secrets. Masks became the bridge. They allowed everyone to play at being someone else while pretending the rules still held. A nobleman could gamble anonymously, a priest could flirt, a servant could mock her mistress. The disguise flattened the social scale, if only temporarily. For a few hours, everyone might be equal at least until the mask came off and the bills were due. But there's another side to this, less glamorous. Venice wasn't just a place of festivals, it was a city that stank, literally. The lagoon water carried centuries of rot. Imagine heat pressing down in July, fish guts tossed from market stalls, chamber pots emptied into the canals. The smell was so thick it probably clung to your clothes even after you left the city. Perfumed masks helped soften the blow. Some were lined with scented cloth or herbs. Behind a mask you could filter out at least a fraction of the daily stench. Not exactly what the brochures advertise. And then there was the problem of surveillance. Venice ran on gossip, but it also ran on spies. The government operated a vast network of informants. Anonymous letters could be slipped into stone mouths carved into walls, literally public drop boxes for accusations. Anyone could denounce anyone. In such a climate, a mask was both liberating and suspicious. Liberating because you could glide past enemies unnoticed. Suspicious because, well, what were you hiding? Now, within this broader masquerade culture, most masks allowed for interaction. The bouter, for example, had a prominent chin jutting outward so you could talk, eat, and drink while wearing it. A man in a bouter mask could down a plate of spaghetti and still look like a blank porcelain ghost, practical in a very Venetian sense. There were also the grotesque masks, the Medico della Peste, with its long beak-like nose stuffed with herbs. Originally medical but later used as carnival caricature, these were playful, satirical, interactive. You could laugh, bargain, shout, and still remain disguised. And then suddenly, you have the Moretta, the exact opposite of interactive. Instead of encouraging conversation, it cut it off. Instead of freedom, it enforced silence. Instead of playful exaggeration, it demanded erasure. It's as if everyone at a masquerade party is sipping cocktails and making witty banter, and then one guest walks in duct-taped across the mouth. Everyone notices. Everyone wonders, and yet somehow it became popular, at least for a while. The Moretta was used primarily by women, especially noble women, and that makes sense once you consider Venetian gender dynamics. Women were both highly visible and deeply restricted, visible in their roles as ornaments of wealth, dressed in silks, paraded through public spaces, arranged in marriages that strengthened family alliances, restricted in their legal and political voice, shut out of most formal power. The Moretta was like a theatrical exaggeration of that condition. You could see her, but you couldn't hear her. But in Venice, exaggeration was the point. Life there was already theatrical. The city itself was a stage. Canals instead of streets, balconies instead of sidewalks, gondoliers as background singers. Carnival lasted for weeks, sometimes months, blurring the line between festival and everyday routine. To wear a Moretta wasn't simply to obey some strange fashion. It was to participate in the larger drama of Venetian life. You weren't a person exactly, you were a role, and the mask, whether gilded or mute, helped you play it. It's worth noting that Venice wasn't unique in its love of masks, but it pushed the obsession further than most places. Ancient Greeks used masks in theatre, of course. Medieval Europe had festive disguises and certain rituals, but Venice institutionalized it. The government regulated mask wearing with laws, specifying when and where masks could be worn. Imagine your city council issuing decrees about acceptable costume days. That was Venice's version of civic order. Yet behind all the glitter, masks carried darker implications. They enabled crimes. Thieves could blend into the crowd. Lovers could arrange secret meetings. Political plots could unfold unseen. In fact, the government occasionally cracked down on masks precisely because they were too effective at hiding identities. The line between playful anonymity and dangerous concealment was razor thin. This is why the Moretta's silence was so charged. It didn't just hide the face, it suppressed the voice. And in a city where masks already worried the authorities, one that literally enforced muteness was both alluring and troubling. It looked like obedience, but could just as easily conceal rebellion. A woman in a Moretta might be a dutiful noble playing the mute servant, or she might be silently mocking every man in the room. Who could tell? Picture it. A narrow Venetian call at dusk, lamps flickering in the damp air, two women walking past, cloaked in black, their faces erased by Moretta masks. They do not speak, they cannot. Their silence echoes louder than any gondolier's song. Everyone turns to look, unsure whether to be fascinated or unnerved. That was Venice in miniature, half stage, half prison, beautiful and bizarre. And because this is Venice, where irony is a civic tradition, the very same authorities who licensed masks for Carnival also worried constantly about what people were doing behind them. The Republic's leaders knew too well that anonymity breeds both pleasure and danger. For every romantic serenade made possible by disguise, there was a duel, a theft, a conspiracy. The Moretta fit into that double-edged pattern perfectly. From a distance, then, it's tempting to romanticize Venice as a place of endless play, but up close, it was play laced with paranoia. Masks gave people freedom, but also forced the government to invent new ways of control. And the Moretta, strange little velvet oval that it was, embodied this tension more starkly than any other disguise. It was both fashion statement and gag, liberation and silencing, power and restraint. You might wonder now, did people truly enjoy wearing these things, or were they trapped by fashion into pretending? Probably a bit of both. Just as you might wear shoes that pinch your toes because they make the outfit, Venetian women wore Moretta masks because they made a statement. They made you into an enigma, and in a society addicted to appearances, being an enigma was valuable, even if it meant aching jaws and clenched teeth. The mask wasn't a casual choice, it was a ritualized gesture. To put it on was to agree to silence, to appear as absence, as mystery. You were participating in the city's endless drama, where every bridge, every canal, every crumbling palace was another stage set. And that perhaps is why the Moretta was tolerated for as long as it was. Venice needed its masks, its illusions, its little dramas of identity. Even one as impractical and unsettling as this, especially one as unsettling as this. Imagine for a moment that you've agreed to wear one. Someone hands you this oval of black velvet, smooth but heavy, its contours strangely blank, no expression, no decoration, just a void. On the inside, a simple fastening mechanism, a button, nothing more. You lift it up, place it against your face, and bite down. The mask clings to you only because your teeth are holding that button in place. Suddenly, you can't talk, you can't smile, your lips are sealed shut by design. At first you might laugh at the absurdity, but then you realize you can't. The button presses against your tongue, forcing your jaw into a constant clench. After only a few minutes, your muscles ache slightly. If you've ever tried to hold a pencil between your teeth while concentrating on something, you'll understand. It's manageable but not natural, and the longer you wear it, the more you notice every tiny discomfort. The dry mouth, the tension in your jaw, the muffled breath escaping only from your nose. Now add to this the weight of a Venetian gown, heavy silks, stiff stays, layers that swish and rustle every time you shift your posture. The mask is not alone, it's part of a larger costume that already restricts your body. A Moretta doesn't just silence your voice, it completes the performance of controlled elegance. You move slowly, deliberately, because fast movements feel awkward with a clamped jaw and heavy skirts. Every gesture is exaggerated by necessity. That's where the strangeness lies. The mask didn't simply hide your face, it trained your body. You had to develop a whole vocabulary of silence. The tilt of a head, the flick of a wrist, the lean of a shoulder, subtle signals replace spoken words. If you wanted to reject someone, you might turn away. If you wanted to welcome them, you might incline your chin. These gestures became their own kind of theatre, one that others had to learn how to read. Picture a Venetian salon again. The hum of voices, the shuffling of cards at the gambling table, the faint tinkling of glass as wine is poured. And in the corner, a woman in a Moretta mask. She says nothing. She simply turns her masked face slightly, her gaze invisible. Every man in the room wonders, is she looking at me? Is she ignoring me? The ambiguity becomes part of the allure. You might call this enforced silence oppressive, and you'd be right. But here's the paradox. Some women found freedom in it. By surrendering their voice, they gained another form of power, mystery. In a society where women were already limited in how much they could say publicly, Leaning into silence could be strategic. With the mask on, a woman became unreadable. Others projected whatever they wanted onto her. She could observe without being observed, listen without being interrogated. Think of it like social media today. Some people post constant updates, filling every gap with chatter. Others remain silent, posting almost nothing. And strangely, the silent ones often draw more curiosity. What are they doing? What do they think? Their very absence of communication becomes its own kind of presence. The Moretta worked the same way, centuries earlier. But of course, silence comes at a cost. Try holding your jaw clenched for an hour, then two. The mask wasn't made for comfort. Women complained, though often in private, about how exhausting it was, and yet they kept wearing it, because fashion doesn't listen to the body. Fashion listens to spectacle. In Venice, silence was fashionable, and if your molars ached, that was simply the price of beauty. There's another sensory detail worth imagining: the heat. Venetian salons and ballrooms weren't air-conditioned, to put it mildly. Picture dozens of candles burning, wax melting down in sticky drips. The air heavy with perfume, sweat and smoke. Now add a layer of velvet pressed against your face. Breathing becomes hot, damp and claustrophobic. The mask doesn't ventilate well. You inhale the faint musk of fabric, mixed with your own breath, and try to remain composed. Glamorous? Not exactly. It wasn't just the wearer who felt the strangeness. Onlookers did too. Encountering someone in a Moretta mask was unsettling. No eye contact, no expression, just a black void staring back. In a culture where conversation was constant and witty banter prized, silence felt alien. Some accounts suggest the mask was both admired and feared. Admired for its elegance, feared for its emptiness. It was as if the woman had become less than human, more like a moving silhouette. And yet, in certain contexts, that was exactly the appeal. At funerals, for example, the Moretta made a kind of sense. The silence, the absence, the visual void. It suited mourning rituals. A woman in black, veiled and masked, could embody grief without a word. The mask erased individuality, allowing her to blend into the collective sorrow. Even there, however, the effect was unnerving. Imagine an entire row of silent black faces in a church, each clamped shut, candles flickering. It must have looked more like a secret society than a religious gathering. Foreign visitors noticed. Travel writers of the 17th and 18th centuries often commented on Venetian masks. Some found them exotic, others ridiculous. Many were baffled by the Moretta in particular. Why would a society silence its women even further by requiring them to hold a mask in place with their teeth? The answer, of course, was layered. Fashion, ritual, control, allure. But to outsiders, it looked like one more eccentricity in a city already bursting with them. And if you zoom out further, you see how the Moretta wasn't simply an accessory. It was a reflection of Venice itself. The Republic was built on silence. Political debates happened behind closed doors. Decisions were made by secret councils. Spies whispered in dark corners. The city's survival depended on what wasn't said as much as on what was. The Moretta, in that sense, was Venice in miniature. A blank face, a muted voice, a mystery concealed behind ritual. But let's not romanticize it too much. Wearing the Moretta was awkward, sweaty, and often ridiculous. Imagine trying to sneeze while holding a button between your teeth. Imagine trying to stifle a laugh without dropping the mask. Imagine needing a sip of water, but first having to spit the whole contraption out. Daily inconveniences piled up, and yet this impractical little mask held sway for more than a century, proof, if ever you needed it, that human beings will endure almost anything in the name of fashion and status. And maybe that's the most telling detail. The Moretta wasn't practical, wasn't glamorous in the usual sense, wasn't comfortable, but it was unique. It made women into enigmas, and in a city addicted to mystery, that was enough. By now, you can probably see why the Moretta was never just a piece of fabric. It was a walking paradox. A woman who wore it was visible yet erased, alluring yet mute, free yet restrained. And paradoxes make people nervous, especially governments. Venice, for all its glittering decadence, was not a city that tolerated too much unpredictability. It had survived centuries by controlling appearances. The Republic liked masks, yes, but only when masks served order. when they blurred lines just enough to let people play without threatening stability. The Moretta, however, sat on the edge of that balance. It silenced women in a way that made them unreadable, and unreadable people are dangerous, whether they intend to be or not. You have to imagine the atmosphere of Venice in the 18th century. The Republic was old, not collapsing just yet, but fraying at the edges. Its golden age of trade had passed. Other powers, France, England, the Ottomans, were outpacing it. Venice still staged its grand rituals, its carnivals, its operas, but behind the spectacle was a creeping anxiety, a sense that the city's glory was more costume than reality. And when a society feels its grip slipping, it starts to police symbols. The Moretta was one of those symbols. On the surface, it seemed harmless, just a fashionable mask for women, but look closer, and you saw a host of uncomfortable implications. First, the enforced silence. To bite down on a button was to give up speech, to become literally voiceless. This reinforced the idea that noble women were meant to be seen but not heard. For some men, this was convenient. For others, particularly moral reformers and church authorities, it looked suspiciously like mockery. Was the mask celebrating obedience, or was it satirizing it? The ambiguity made it threatening. And then there was the anonymity problem. Venice was already full of worries about what people did behind masks. Gambling dens, secret lovers, whispered conspiracies. The government regularly issued decrees limiting when and where masks could be worn. They didn't want criminals blending into polite society. They didn't want political rebels hiding in plain sight. And here was the Moretta, a mask designed not just to hide the face, but to cut off speech. In effect, it created a class of silent, unreadable figures gliding through the city. How could the authorities possibly trust that? Foreign visitors fueled the suspicion. Travelogues from the 18th century often mocked the Moretta, calling it eerie, grotesque, or absurd. They couldn't understand why Venetian women would voluntarily gag themselves with a button. To outsiders, it looked almost ritualistic, like some strange cult accessory, rather than a fashion statement. Venice, already defensive about its reputation, didn't appreciate being laughed at. The more foreigners mocked the mask, the more local authorities wondered whether it was worth keeping around. But the real turning point came with the shifting moral climate. By the late 18th century, Enlightenment ideas were filtering into Venice. Rationality, order, progress. At least in theory, old rituals were increasingly criticized as decadent, archaic, superstitious. Masks in general came under fire, but the Moretta was especially vulnerable. It looked less like playful disguise and more like willful regression, a black velvet relic of an earlier age. And if there's one thing reformers dislike, it's relics that make people look ridiculous. There's also the matter of practicality. The Balta mask, remember, had a built-in excuse. You could eat, drink and talk while wearing it. It was practical for social events, useful for both men and women, even sanctioned in political settings. The Moretta, by contrast, offered no such excuse. You couldn't drink, you couldn't talk, you couldn't even smile politely. It was all inconvenience, no utility. And when authorities started weighing which traditions to keep and which to discard, the Moretta didn't make the cut. Imagine for a moment being a Venetian magistrate tasked with writing laws about masks. You're sitting at a heavy wooden desk, papers stacked high, the smell of ink and damp parchment in the air. You've already banned certain masks in gambling halls, restricted Carnival to certain months, punished crimes committed in disguise. Now you have this peculiar velvet oval to deal with. Do you defend it? Do you justify why women should gag themselves with buttons at funerals and salons? Or do you quietly cross it off the list and hope nobody notices? History suggests the latter. By the end of the 18th century, the Moretta had simply fallen out of favour. Authorities discouraged it, society mocked it, and fashion moved on. What was once alluring now looked outdated, even faintly embarrassing. Women abandoned it for lighter veils, for other masks, or for no mask at all. And when Napoleon finally marched into Venice in 1797, dismantling the Republic, the Moretta was already on the rubbish heap of history. But notice the irony. The mask was banned, or at least effectively erased, not because it was too liberating, but because it was too strange, too ambiguous, too impractical. It didn't fit into the neat boxes of Enlightenment rationality. It was too theatrical in a world that wanted to move toward bureaucracy and order. Venice itself, with its crumbling palaces and endless rituals, would soon be mocked in the same way, beautiful, yes, but ridiculous, decadent, obsolete. The Moretta was just an early casualty of that shift. Let's step back here and imagine the emotional experience of that ban. Picture a noble woman who had worn the Moretta for decades. She remembers her first salon, her jaw aching from holding the button. She remembers the thrill of being unreadable, the way men projected their fantasies onto her silence. She remembers funerals where the black velvet seemed to merge with mourning clothes, turning grief into performance. And now, suddenly, it is over. The mask is not fashionable, not respectable, not even allowed. She tucks it into a drawer, perhaps, or burns it quietly, a piece of her own past turned into contraband. It's a reminder that fashion isn't just about clothes, it's about identity. To ban a mask is to ban a way of being. The Moretta wasn't just velvet and buttons, it was an entire posture of silence, an entire choreography of gestures, an entire aura of mystery. When it vanished, a piece of Venetian theatre vanished with it, and perhaps that's why we find it so haunting today. Not because the mask was beautiful. It wasn't, not in the conventional sense, but because it embodied the contradictions of Venice itself, a city of spectacle that silenced its own women, a society that adored secrecy but feared it at the same time, a culture that clung to illusions until the very end and then watched them dissolve. The Moretta's ban wasn't loud. There was no great public outcry, no dramatic confrontation. It simply faded, like candle smoke in a damp room. By the time Venice fell, it was already gone, but the silence it left behind still lingers, unsettling in its absence. So the Moretta was gone, not with a bang, but with a slow sigh, like a candle guttering out in a drafty room. By the late 18th century, its absence was barely noticed. A few older women may have kept one folded away in a drawer, a relic of their younger days, the velvet flattened and the button worn smooth by years of clenched teeth. But on the streets, in the salons, in the theatres, it was disappearing. You might think people celebrated. After all, who wants to clamp a button in their mouth for hours at a time? Who wants the jaw aches, the headaches, the damp heat of velvet against skin? Yet fashion has a way of making even discomfort into nostalgia. Some women missed the mask, not because it was comfortable, but because it had given them something rare, the ability to vanish in plain sight. Imagine suddenly losing that tool. Without the Moretta, you could still wear other masks, yes, but none had quite the same effect. The Boetta let you eat and talk. The Columbina, a half-mask, allowed flirtatious smiles. Even the grotesque plague doctor mask offered comic exaggeration, but none silenced you in quite the same way. None made you into a floating absence, a figure defined more by what couldn't be seen or heard than by what could. Without the Moretta, women returned to the noisy game of wit and chatter, forced once again to play by the rules of verbal sparring in a society where words could be both currency and weapon. Now step back into the wider Venetian stage. The city itself was losing its masks in a metaphorical sense. For centuries, Venice had thrived on ritual disguises, elaborate ceremonies, secret councils, mysterious symbols of continuity. It projected stability while quietly rotting underneath. By the late 1700s, those masks were slipping. The Republic was financially weak, politically isolated, mocked by the very powers it once rivaled. The Moretta's disappearance was part of a larger unmasking, one that revealed not mystery but decline. And yet Venetians were slow to admit it. They always were. Even as trade dwindled, they clung to Carnival, to processions, to gondola parades where artificial islands floated through the lagoon, carrying mock palaces and costumed actors. It was theatre as survival, but theatre works best when the audience suspends disbelief. And by the 18th century, the rest of Europe wasn't suspending anything. Visitors came, gawked, and wrote home about the charming but decaying city, its worn rituals, its eerie masks. For Venetian women, the absence of the Moretta meant a subtle shift in their visibility. Without the silent black oval, their presence at salons and funerals was more ordinary, less uncanny. They could smile again, speak again, sip wine again, without fumbling with a gagging button. In practical terms, this was surely a relief, but in symbolic terms, it was a loss of one of the few tools that let them control how they were perceived. Silence, paradoxically, had been a weapon. With it gone, women were thrust back into roles more easily defined by others. Consider the irony. The Moretta had been criticized as oppressive, as a literal gag, and yet its disappearance did not bring greater freedom. It simply erased one of the few costumes that allowed women to reclaim silence on their own terms. You couldn't ignore someone in a Moretta. You couldn't reduce her to chatter or gossip, because she physically couldn't participate. You had to confront her as a mystery. Without the mask, the mystery faded. There's something profoundly Venetian about that paradox. In a city built on illusions, sometimes illusion was the only protection. The Moretta was illusion weaponized. Take it away, and women were left with the bare reality. A reality less flattering, less mysterious, and far less equal. Of course, there were those who didn't mourn. Reformers and Enlightenment thinkers saw the disappearance as progress. A gagging velvet oval was a relic of a decadent age, they argued, and Venice should step into modernity with rational customs, clear laws, open faces. No more silent women gliding through candlelit salons like phantoms. No more theatrical excess. A society should be legible, orderly, rational. It all sounded good on paper. But anyone who has sat through a very long, very rational committee meeting knows that clarity is not always the most exciting option. Meanwhile, in other parts of Europe, fashion was shifting too. Paris was the capital of taste, dictating trends that rippled outward. There, women's masks were lighter, flirtier, designed to reveal as much as they concealed. The Moretta, by comparison, looked heavy, archaic, funereal. To be rid of it was to align Venice, however belatedly, with the broader European fashion scene. It was a small nod to relevance in a world where Venice's relevance was shrinking fast. And yet, some foreigners missed it. The same travel writers who mocked the mask also admitted that it had a certain unique charm. A Venetian salon without Morettas felt less exotic, less mysterious. The eerie silence of masked women had been part of what made Venice unforgettable. Without it, the city was just another place of candlelit gambling and stiff etiquette. Quirky perhaps, but not singular. If you visit Venice today, you'll see endless masks for sale, painted, feathered, sparkling, hanging in shop windows along every tourist path, but you'll almost never see a Moretta. It's too strange, too impractical to market as a souvenir. No tourist wants to bite down on a button while shuffling through St. Mark's Square, and so the Moretta remains absent, just as it was in its final years. Absent in the city, absent in memory, absent in the glossy brochures. But absence has its own power. The very fact that the Moretta is not reproduced, not commodified, not paraded in tourist carnivals, gives it a lingering aura. It belongs to the shadows of Venice, not to the shop fronts. To know about it is to glimpse the city's darker, stranger history, the part that doesn't fit neatly into romance novels or Instagram posts. In that sense, the Moretta still works as it always did. It speaks through silence. So what did life look like without it? Quieter, in a way, less unsettling, but also flatter, less layered. Venice lost one of its strangest theatrical props, and with it, a piece of the mystery that made the city feel half dream, half nightmare. Without the Moretta, Venice was still beautiful, still decadent, still decaying, but no longer quite as uncanny. And perhaps that's the lesson. When you erase the things that make a place strange, you also erase the things that make it unforgettable. The Moretta was banned as impractical, irrational, even embarrassing. But in its absence, Venice became just a little more ordinary, a little less itself. Walk into a Venetian mask shop today, and you'll be dazzled by feathers, gold paint, rhinestones, harlequin patterns, row after row of carnival glitter. It's like stepping into a costume closet for a particularly enthusiastic opera company. The masks you see are colourful, light, whimsical. They're designed to look good in selfies, to survive a suitcase, to serve as a bright souvenir of a romantic trip. What you won't see, at least almost never, is the Moretta. A plain oval of black velvet doesn't sell well in a city that depends on tourists. Nobody wants to lug home a mask that requires you to bite down on a button just to keep it on. The shopkeeper would have to demonstrate, and nothing kills a sale faster than seeing someone clench their teeth like they're preparing for dental surgery. And so the Moretta has slipped into obscurity. Even Venetians themselves don't talk about it much. When locals dress for Carnival, they might choose the Bolter because it's iconic, or the Colombina because it's charming, or even the Plague Doctor because it's deliciously grotesque. But the silent black oval? Too unsettling, too impractical, too forgotten. Yet historians can't help being drawn to it, because the Moretta, more than any other mask, reveals the contradictions of Venice. It's the one mask that refuses to play along with the cheerful image of Carnival. It doesn't let you smile, doesn't let you flirt, doesn't let you eat. Instead, it confronts you with absence, a velvet void where a face should be, a silence where a voice should be. It's the anti-mask of Venice, the one that erases the very personality it pretends to decorate. Think of how different that is from the masks we know today. The masks you might wear at a costume party, or even the surgical masks we've all grown accustomed to in recent years. Those are pragmatic, protective, sometimes playful. They hide, but they don't gag. They obscure, but they don't erase. The Moretta went further. It wasn't satisfied with hiding the face. It demanded complicity in silence. You had to work to keep it on. It wasn't a passive disguise. It was an active performance of muteness. That performance lingers in cultural memory, even if the object itself doesn't. Writers sometimes mention the Moretta as a symbol of women's voicelessness in early modern Europe. Artists occasionally depict it in paintings of Venetian scenes, though always as a curiosity rather than a central figure. You'll find it in footnotes, in specialized essays, in niche corners of museums. It survives less as a physical artifact and more as a concept, the mask that silenced. There's a strange irony here. The masks that survive in popular imagination are the flamboyant ones. The Borta, the plague doctor, the glittering carnival faces. The Moretta survives precisely because it was forgotten, because it was too eerie, too impractical, too ambiguous. Its absence is what gives it power now. The silence still speaks, centuries later. And if you think about it, the Moretta anticipated something modern, the idea of curated absence. In today's world, people talk constantly about managing their presence, what to post, what to share, what to say. But there's also power in not posting, not sharing, not saying. A social media account that goes silent for months draws more curiosity than one that babbles daily. The Moretta was that silence made velvet, a mute oval that made people lean in, wondering what it concealed. Now, of course, the context was different. Venetian noblewomen weren't controlling Instagram narratives. They were navigating salons and funerals in a society that gave them little space to speak. But the effect was similar. Silence became spectacle. Absence became presence. The mask erased you, and in doing so it made you unforgettable. But here's the darker twist. The Moretta's legacy also reminds us how easy it is to romanticize silence when it's not your own. Men praised the mask for making women mysterious, docile, alluring. Foreigners gawked at its strangeness. Historians marvel at its symbolism, but the women wearing it, they were the ones whose jaws ached, whose teeth pressed grooves into a wooden button, whose ability to speak was literally denied. What looks poetic in hindsight was often just uncomfortable in reality. And maybe that's why the Moretta vanished without much resistance. When fashion shifted, women were quick to abandon it, not because they didn't value the mystery it gave them, but because they didn't miss the headaches. A symbol of silence is one thing, the lived experience of silence is another. Still, the Moretta lingers in Venice's reputation. People call the city mysterious, enigmatic, haunting. Tour guides talk about secret societies, hidden rituals, whispers in shadowed alleys. Much of that mystique is theatre, layered over a very ordinary past. But the Moretta was real. It was the tangible version of that mystique, the mask that truly turned someone into a blank, voiceless presence. And in remembering it, you glimpse the city behind the postcard. So if you wander Venice today, you won't see the Moretta in shop windows. But if you know to look, you might spot it in paintings tucked into corners of museums. You might read about it in obscure travelogues, or you might sense it in the city's silences, the quiet back alleys, the darkened churches, the damp fog that erases detail. Venice itself feels like a Moretta sometimes, beautiful, unsettling, mute. That's the lingering echo, a mask forgotten but not gone, a velvet oval that still haunts the imagination, precisely because it refuses to glitter. So here we are, at the end of the story of a mask that few remember and fewer miss. The Moretta, the mute oval of velvet, banned and forgotten, filed away in history's cabinet of curiosities. And yet, you've spent all this time with it. That alone tells you something. Because the Moretta is not really about velvet or buttons. It's about the strange ways humans turn absence into meaning. You take a city already obsessed with secrecy and disguise, and you invent a mask that silences half its population. It sounds absurd, and it was, but it also worked, at least for a while. People noticed the silence. They filled it with imagination. They projected mystery where there was only jaw-ache. They called it alluring. They called it elegant. And eventually, they called it obsolete. That trajectory is very Venetian. This was a city built on illusions. Palaces rising from water like stage sets. Ceremonies that pretended the Republic was eternal, even as it dwindled. A carnival that let citizens forget poverty, disease, and political stagnation behind a blur of feathers and wine. The Moretta fit perfectly into that landscape. Uncomfortable, impractical, theatrical, and unforgettable, precisely because it erased what was real. Picture the silence again. A woman in a Moretta mask drifting through a crowded salon, men talking loudly, servants shuffling, candles flickering, cards shuffling at a gambling table, and then her mute, faceless, unreadable. Everyone notices, everyone whispers, and she does nothing. She doesn't speak, doesn't smile, doesn't move more than necessary. Her presence is her absence. It's a little funny, if you think about it. Venice created one of the strangest fashion accessories in history by accident. Instead of decorating the face, the Moretta removed it. Instead of giving freedom, it imposed restraint, and somehow people still called it beautiful. That's the power of culture. If you tell yourself something is mysterious long enough, you stop noticing that it's also ridiculous. And yet, we shouldn't laugh too quickly, because we still do this today. We still romanticize silence. We still project mystery onto what we don't understand. A celebrity disappears for a few months, and suddenly everyone speculates, imagines, fills in the blank. A person says nothing in a meeting and is assumed to be wise, when in fact they may just be tired. Absence invites meaning, silence becomes performance. The Moretta just made that performance literal. That's why its banning feels so symbolic. Venice didn't just outlaw a piece of velvet, it outlawed a kind of silence. It said no more blank faces, no more women turning themselves into enigmas. Speak, smile, participate, join the noise, contribute to the chatter, be legible, rational, modern. And maybe, on paper, that was progress. But something was lost too. Because the Moretta, strange as it was, gave women a rare tool of control. Yes, it gagged them, but it also turned them into mysteries. And in a world where women's voices were often ignored, mystery had its own kind of power. When the mask vanished, so did that peculiar weapon. Women were once again visible, audible, but also predictable, ordinary, easy to dismiss. The silence had been oppressive, but it had also been strategic, and now it was gone. The city changed too. Without its oddest mask, Venice became more manageable, more rational, more aligned with Enlightenment taste, but also less itself, less theatrical, less uncanny, less strange. What makes Venice unforgettable is precisely its excesses, its impracticalities, its illusions. When those are trimmed away, what remains is just another fading European city. Beautiful, yes, but not haunted in quite the same way. That's why the Moretta lingers as a ghost in the city's memory. You don't see it in shop windows, but you feel it in the quiet corners, in the fog rolling off the lagoon at night, in the dark alleys where water laps against stone, in the silence of an empty campo after tourists have gone to bed. Venice itself sometimes feels like it's wearing a Moretta, voiceless, faceless, a velvet void of history that refuses to explain itself. So why was the Moretta banned? Officially, because it was impractical, irrational, outdated. Unofficially, because it was too unsettling. It revealed too much about a society that silenced its women, too much about a city addicted to secrecy, too much about the absurdity of fashion itself. Better to ban it quietly than to keep confronting its strangeness. And yet here you are, still thinking about it. That's the final irony. The Moretta, designed to erase presence, has achieved a kind of immortality through absence. It survives not by being worn, but by being remembered, not by glittering in shop windows, but by lurking in footnotes. Its silence echoes louder than all the feathers and sequins that replaced it. So when you next picture Venice, don't just see the gondolas and golden masks. Imagine too the black oval of velvet, the clenched teeth, the silence that turned a woman into a living enigma. and remember that sometimes the strangest parts of history are the ones that vanish first. Because history, like Venice, is never just what you see, it's also what's missing. The Moretta was banned, forgotten, erased, but in that very silence, it still speaks.